What does freedom mean to you? When the city is in chains, the sun rose on April 20, 1775, not over a colony at peace, but over a land at war. The smell of gunpowder still clung to the trees outside Concord. Blood stained the grass where farmers had fallen. The silence that followed the shooting felt heavier than the bullets that had caused it. But the silence did not last. Word moved faster than any army. By noon, couriers were galloping along dusty roads in every direction. Riders, some young boys, some veterans from old wars, shouted the news to every town square, tavern, and church pulpit they passed. The regulars fired on us at Lexington, 8 dead, more wounded. This is it. It's begun. And in that moment, something ancient and quiet shifted in the souls of ordinary people. Plowshares were dropped mid-furrow. Blacksmiths quenched their hammers. Shopkeepers locked their doors not for the day, but for war. They didn't wait for orders. They didn't need them. By dusk, over 15,000 militiamen from Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut, and Rhode Island were marching toward Boston. Some barefoot, many with no uniforms, some with rifles handed down from their grandfathers, others with only axes or pikes. They came not to invade Boston, not to raze it or burn it. They came to surround it, to send a message. Imagine being one of them, a 19-year-old from a Vermont village walking through the night in the cold spring air. You're scared, you've never seen a battle, but your brother was at Lexington. You don't know if he lived, so you keep walking. Inside Boston, the British command realized it too late. General Thomas Gage, the military governor of Massachusetts, had ordered the march on Concord, expecting a quick, surgical operation. Seize the powder, arrest Adams and Hancock, return before breakfast. But now, Gage looked out over Boston Harbor and saw his men limping home, bloodied, exhausted, demoralized, and worse. He saw fires beginning to light on the hills beyond the city. Not from burning buildings, but from campfires. The colonists were digging in. For the families trapped inside Boston, fear took hold. Who could you trust? Some neighbors had sons in red. Others whispered patriot hymns at night. Mothers hushed their children. Men glanced anxiously at every knock on the door. Boston was no longer a city. It was a chessboard, and every square now held danger. Revolutions don't always begin with grand speeches or sacred scrolls. Sometimes they begin with fear, with blood, with smoke rising over a familiar home. And that's what April 20, 1775 was. The day everything changed. The British Army, one of the greatest in the world, had been met not by soldiers, but by farmers and townsmen who refused to run. And now, those same men had the city of Boston surrounded. The siege had begun. But this wasn't just a siege of walls or gates. It was a siege of ideals, of who would define what liberty meant, and who would be willing to suffer to defend it. By the end of April 1775, Boston was no longer a city. It was a trap. The British Army held its heart, but the people, the land, the spirit, those belonged to the colonies now. General Thomas Gage had nearly 6,000 redcoats under his command, but they were penned in by over twice that number in militia. From the north, south, and west, the roads were cut. Supply wagons were halted, letters intercepted, every stone bridge guarded. Boston had become a British island, floating on a sea of rebellion. Imagine being inside Boston at that moment. You wake to the sound of regimental drums echoing down narrow cobbled streets. The smell of salt air mixes with gun, oil, and stale bread. You're not sure who you fear more, the rebels beyond the walls, or the soldiers within them. Neighbors stop talking to each other. Even children grow cautious. One wrong word, one suspected opinion, and you might vanish into the shadows of a military prison. The siege was not just a matter of military positioning. It was a psychological vise. Every day, the pressure tightened. Every week, the food grew scarcer. Flour prices doubled. Salt pork vanished. Fuel ran out by early May. And beneath all this, division grew. Loyalists, those still faithful to the crown, saw the siege as proof of lawlessness. Patriots called it justice. Neutral citizens tried to survive the tightening ropes on both ends. One Boston mother wrote in her diary, "I keep my curtains drawn at night, not for modesty, but for silence. There are ears in every alley, eyes in every pew." This was no longer a political debate. This was a Cold War of neighbors. General Gage knew he was in trouble. He had the city, but not control, not of the roads, not of the mines, not even of his own troops, many of whom had begun to whisper of mutiny, and outside his reach. Militia camps swelled daily. Men arrived with powder and prayers. Tents sprung up on every ridge. Farmers, fishermen, shoemakers, they came by the hundreds, not as conquerors, but as protectors. They weren't trying to destroy Boston. They were trying to reclaim it. This wasn't just a siege of soldiers. It was a siege of ideas. Who ruled this land? Who spoke for its people? Could liberty grow from the soil of resistance? Or would empire crush it underfoot? Boston, once the cradle of commerce and culture, was now a symbol, a city caught between past and future, between a king's authority and a people's awakening. As Boston simmered under siege, the colonies turned their eyes south to Philadelphia. It was here, in early May 1775, that a second gathering of the Continental Congress convened. 13 colonies represented by some of the sharpest minds, the boldest tongues, and the most conflicted hearts. Some came for peace, others came for war, and then there was George Washington. He didn't say much at first. At 6 feet tall, in a world where most men stood a head shorter, Washington didn't need to raise his voice to be noticed. He entered the chamber in his militia uniform, blue and buff, simple and pressed, with a steel, hilted sword at his side. No theatrics, no declaration, just presence. Imagine his thoughts as he rode north from Mount Vernon. The roads were lined with rumors of war, of death, of rebellion and retaliation. Washington wasn't yet father of his country. He was a planter, a veteran, and a widely respected delegate, but still uncertain what the future held. And though he wore a uniform, he had not yet been given an army. That would soon change. By June, debate was raging inside the halls of Congress. Should they send more petitions to the king? Was it too late for reconciliation? Or had the time come to raise an army, not to protest, but to resist? Then came the moment. John Adams of Massachusetts rose to speak. His voice wasn't the loudest. His style wasn't polished. But his message was clear. We must adopt the army now gathered outside Boston as our own. And we must place it under a commander, a Virginian. That Virginian was sitting right beside him, George Washington. Washington didn't leap to accept. He left the chamber, walked alone among the gardens, stared quietly into the trees. He understood the weight of what was being asked. He would not be commanding Virginia's men. He would be leading all of them, from the hills of Carolina to the rocky coast of Maine. This was no militia skirmish. This was the beginning of a continental war. What did he feel in that moment? Duty, yes, resolve, but also fear. He had seen war up close in the French and Indian conflict, and knew how brutal it could be. He had made mistakes in the past, mistakes that had cost lives. And yet, he also believed, deep in his chest, that this fight was unlike any before. On June 15, 1775, Congress officially appointed George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. His response, "I do not think myself equal to the command I am honored with." But he accepted it, not for glory, not for revenge, but because he believed this cause, liberty, dignity, self-governance, was worth more than life itself. And in that moment, something shifted, not just in Washington, but in the very nature of the revolution. This wasn't just Massachusetts' fight anymore. It became a fight for a new identity, a united resistance from scattered colonies suddenly bound by shared purpose. And so, a man from Virginia would ride north to Boston, not to command from behind a desk, but to walk among farmers with pitchforks, to sleep beside freezing tents, and to lead not as a general of conquest, but as a servant of a cause. While George Washington packed his saddle for the long road to Boston, while militias hammered stakes into the Massachusetts soil, another revolution was stirring, not with muskets, not with drums, but with words. Step inside a tavern in 1775. The door creaks. Smoke curls from clay pipes. Tankards clink. A fire crackles in the hearth, and at nearly every table, men lean in close, not for drink alone, but for information. Because taverns weren't just watering holes in colonial America. They were newsrooms, parliaments, nerve centers of the resistance. This was how most Americans first learned about what had happened at Lexington and Concord, not from official reports, but from tavern whispers. A traveler from New Haven brings word. The British fired first, shot a man straight through the chest. A post rider from Worcester leans across the table. They say it was an ambush. The redcoats marched in, and the ground rose up to meet them. Fact blurred with rumor, truth mixed with fear, but the effect was the same. Unity through outrage. For years, the colonies had been grumbling about taxes, about trade, about soldiers housed in their homes. But now it was personal. They killed our neighbors. They bled us on our own soil. What will they do next? In these taverns, ordinary men began to think the unthinkable, not just protest, not just petition, but break. In a dim Boston alehouse, one night in early May, a conversation unfolds between two old friends. Let's call them Samuel and William. Samuel's voice is low, nervous. Have you heard? The Congress has called up troops. They say Washington's coming. William leans closer. Aye, and they'll hang him for it. Samuel glances around, shadows flickering on the walls. Then, with trembling hands, he places a small folded pamphlet on the table. Common Sense by Thomas Paine. It hadn't been written yet, not in May, but the spirit of common sense was already brewing. Colonists were tired of pretending they were still Englishmen when they were being treated as subjects, tired of bowing to a king 0 miles away who had never stepped foot on their land, but still claimed ownership of their lives. And in taverns like these, from Charleston to Albany, the idea of independence began as a whisper, a dangerous whisper, a sacred one, but it wasn't easy. There were still many who couldn't bring themselves to say the word revolution. Older men who'd fought beside British officers in the French and Indian War. Merchants whose cargo still depended on royal protection. Mothers who feared what war would bring to their doorsteps. One Virginia printer wrote, "The people speak of rebellion in the same breath as they ask for bread. They do not cheer. They murmur, but the murmur grows. Taverns were not where the Declaration was signed, but they were where its fire was lit, where fear turned into defiance, where conversation became commitment." Narrator closing beat, the tavern table, the low stool, the whispered warning by the fire, these were the front lines of a different kind of battle. The battle for imagination, the battle for belief, because long before anyone declared independence with a flourish of the quill, they declared it in their hearts, while cities like Boston and Philadelphia swelled with protest and purpose. The edges of the colonies told a different story, a wilder story, one not written on parchment or debated in Congress, but carved into the bark of trees, echoed through rifle cracks, and whispered under the stars. The American frontier stretched far west, beyond the Appalachian Mountains, into places where maps turned vague and rivers carried rumors instead of names. It was here that another kind of conflict had already begun, not between British and colonists, but between settlers and empires, French, British, Spanish, and most of all native. Imagine a small homestead in western Pennsylvania, spring of 1775, a log cabin built with bare hands, a woman stirring cornmeal beside a fire, her husband sharpening tools, two children playing with a carved wooden rabbit in the dirt. They are 300 miles from Boston, but the tension is just as real here. Not redcoats, but raiders, not declarations, but survival, because here, the frontier is not a political idea, It's life or death, every day. The proclamation line of 1763, issued by the Crown after the French and Indian War, had tried to halt settlement west of the Appalachians. But settlers kept going. They pushed west into Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, often clashing with native nations who had lived on those lands for centuries. And when the British tried to enforce that line, tried to say stop, this land is not yours, many colonists didn't see fairness. They saw betrayal. These were people who had fought alongside the British against the French, who had lost sons in those battles, who had cleared forests, planted wheat, buried their dead beneath rough, hewn stones. And now, the same Crown that had encouraged them to settle was telling them they were trespassers. The truth was, to many frontier families, King George was not a protector. He was just another distant master, another man in silk declaring rules over lands he'd never seen. They weren't reading Locke or Montesquieu. They weren't quoting Cicero or forming committees. They were living revolution with every fence post. And yet, even out here, the echoes of Lexington and Concord reached them. Couriers rode west with news. Pamphlets found their way into saddlebags. A minister might read aloud from a Massachusetts broadside before Sunday prayers. A trader might pass around a story of how farmers in Concord stood their ground. And slowly, something stirred even among these scattered communities, a shared identity, not just Virginians, not just Pennsylvanians, but Americans. There's a story, perhaps legend, perhaps truth, of a frontiersman who heard about the British attack on Concord while trapping beaver in the Shenandoah Valley. He packed his rifle, kissed his sleeping daughter on the forehead, and began walking northeast. He said only one word to the friend who asked why: mine. That's what revolution looked like in the woods. It wasn't parchment or process, it was gut. A refusal to be told what land to live on, what taxes to pay, what king to serve. A raw understanding that liberty wasn't granted, it was claimed. Of course, the frontier was no utopia. Settlers pushed into native lands with force and fire. Indigenous tribes faced betrayal from both colonists and Crown. Some nations allied with Britain to protect their homelands. Others were torn apart by the coming storm. This was not a clean revolution. This was a collision of worlds. For native peoples, the revolution was not a question of taxes or laws. It was a question of survival, and for every echo of freedom that rang through the forests, another echo cried of loss. Still, the frontier mattered, because it reminded the colonies of something essential. That freedom was messy. It wasn't debated in perfect sentences or signed beneath chandeliers. It was carved into cold ground, hammered into rifles, spoken not with eloquence, but with fire, and from the furthest ridge of the Alleghenies to the cracked floorboards of a Boston home. That fire was spreading. Picture it, June 1775. The sun rises over Philadelphia, casting long shadows across cobblestone streets still slick with morning dew. Inside the State House, now called Independence Hall, windows creak open. Men in worn coats and powdered wigs step inside, clutching letters, arguments, and the weight of history. They're delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies, summoned not for ceremony, but for war. The shooting at Lexington and Concord changed everything. No more diplomacy, no more petitions to His Majesty. What began as resistance had become something else, something far more dangerous: rebellion. But rebellion needs structure, rebellion needs direction, and rebellion needs a leader. Inside the Second Continental Congress, chairs scrape, tempers rise, papers shuffle. Among the delegates is a tall, silent man from Virginia. Broad-shouldered, reserved, his brown uniform is the only military coat in the room. His name, George Washington. John Adams stands. He raises his voice. I nominate a gentleman whose skill and experience will command the respect of all. Colonel George Washington of Virginia. No applause, just stillness, because what Adams has done is irreversible. He hasn't just named a man, he's declared war. Washington says nothing, only bows, but inside, he's trembling. This isn't ambition, it's duty. And it's fear because he knows the truth. This army they speak of, it barely exists. Let's leave Philadelphia for a moment. Let's go to Massachusetts, to Cambridge, just outside Boston. There, in makeshift tents and farmhouses, is the army Washington will inherit. They're farmers with muskets, butchers with pikes, blacksmiths who have never drilled in formation. Shoes are scarce, powder is short, morale is fragile. They don't even have a name. Some call them New Englanders. Others just say the rabble. But Washington, he sees something else. He sees possibility. He sees a nation, not yet born, waiting to take shape in the discipline of a line, the echo of a drum, the courage to stand still under fire. On July 3rd, 1775, Washington takes command. Not with pomp, not with glory, just a firm grip on the reins of his horse, and a silent prayer in his heart. He surveys his men tired, hungry, untrained, and he sees not what they are, but what they might become. But building an army isn't about barking orders. It's about trust, and trust doesn't come easy. Many of these men are skeptical of a Virginian commanding New England troops. Some think him too aristocratic. Others wonder if he understands what's at stake, not just for them, but for their families hiding in valleys beyond the mountains. So Washington walks among them. He listens. He eats their food. He writes home, requesting better pay, better blankets, better boots for them. Not for himself. This is where his legend begins, not in battle, but in the space between battles, the space where trust is forged. Meanwhile, the British dig in across the river in Boston. Red uniforms glint in the summer sun. They have ships, cannons, discipline, a global empire behind them, and yet they're surrounded, trapped by the very rabble they underestimated. From the Carolinas to New Hampshire, word spreads, Washington's in command now. The colonies are united. There's an army forming. And for the first time, there's a flicker of belief that maybe, just maybe, they're not just rebelling, they're building something. You can measure a nation's strength by its armies, but you can measure its soul by who chooses to serve. And in these early days of the Revolution, service meant uncertainty, no pay, no security, no promises, only sacrifice. One young private writes home to his mother, "I do not know if we shall succeed, but I could not stay behind and wonder. I had to stand even if I fall." And that, more than any musket or uniform, is what gave birth to the Continental Army. Not orders, not rank, but belief. So yes, June of 1775 gave the colonies a general, but more than that, it gave them a symbol. A tall, quiet man in a faded blue coat, standing before a ragged line of volunteers with no banner but their own courage. An army with no nation, yet, but now. Something had begun, something that wouldn't stop. Not until liberty was no longer an idea, but a reality, before there was an American Revolution, before muskets fired or declarations were signed. There were voices, not generals, not kings, but firebrands, the men and women who ignited rebellion with ink, ideas, and bold defiance. Picture a Boston tavern in 1772. The air is thick with pipe smoke, and spilled ale glistens on the oak floor. Men huddle at candlelit tables, speaking in whispers, not of crops, not of trade, but of liberty, of tyranny, of rights that no king can take. One man leans in. His voice is gravel and thunder. His name, Samuel Adams. Samuel Adams isn't a soldier. He doesn't carry a musket, but give him a quill and a sheet of paper. He's lethal. He stirs passions like a blacksmith stirs molten iron. He writes pamphlets that reach beyond Boston, carried on horseback, tucked into coat pockets, whispered from lips to ears across the colonies. No taxation without representation. 4 words that light the fuse of a revolution. Samuel Adams doesn't just write, he organizes. He forms the committees of correspondence, a kind of colonial internet. Towns hundreds of miles apart now share news in real time, what the Crown does in New York. Virginia knows by morning, it's the bloodstream of rebellion, and Adams built the veins, but the revolution wasn't just fueled by men in wigs and coats. Step into a candlelit parlor in Massachusetts. A woman leans over a page, her pen steady, her mind sharp. Her name, Mercy Otis Warren. Long before America was born, Mercy was writing plays, satire, and essays that mocked the British and emboldened the Patriots. She called out corruption. She called out injustice. And she did it when women were expected to remain silent. The rights of mankind must be secured. She once wrote, not only by arms, but by ideas. And she gave those ideas teeth. If Sam Adams stoked the fire, Mercy Otis Warren shaped the flame. And then there's the lightning bolt, Patrick Henry, March 1775, St. John's Church, Richmond, Virginia. The pews are packed, tension crackles in the air. Some men still hope for peace. But Patrick Henry rises, his eyes blaze, his voice booms. The war is inevitable. And let it come, I repeat it, sir, let it come. He raises a clenched fist, then extends his arms wide. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. The room explodes, and so does the nation, because those words, they aren't a speech, they're a spark, a call to arms. Not everyone answered with muskets. Some picked up presses instead. In Philadelphia, a printer named Benjamin Franklin had already made himself famous in London, until he was humiliated before Parliament for daring to support the colonists' cause. He came back changed, older, wiser, and ready to fight with reason. Franklin wasn't just an inventor or a diplomat. He was a bridge between generations, between ideas, between colonies. He whispered in the ears of kings, but he listened to the cries of farmers. And when the time came to choose, he chose freedom. Then, in early 1776, came a pamphlet, just a few dozen pages, printed on cheap paper, but its words would change the course of history. Common Sense, written by Thomas Paine. Paine didn't mince words. He called the king a tyrant. He said monarchy was unnatural. He called for independence, loudly, directly, and now, these are the times that try men's souls. He sold 500,000 copies in months, in a world with no internet, no TV, no radio. His words hit like a thunderclap. Suddenly, independence wasn't a fringe idea. It was common sense, and all across the colony, round hearths, in barns, on docks and fields, people began to speak of liberty not as a dream, but as a destiny. The firebrands didn't fire the first shots. They lit the minds of men and women who would. They didn't march into battle, but they gave the revolution its soul, a soul forged not just by war, but by words. What begins in anger doesn't always end in clarity. In the early 1770s, across the American colonies, there was plenty of anger. There were protests, boycotts, street brawls, fiery sermons. Midnight pamphlets nailed to tavern doors, but protest is not a plan. You can shout for justice. You can march against tyranny, but sooner or later, you need to decide what you're fighting for. Imagine this. You're in a Boston workshop. The floor is littered with wood shavings. A hammer echoes through the rafters. A radio doesn't exist, but the news travels anyway, passed by sailors, whispered by strangers, shouted in meeting houses. And all of it sounds the same. They've closed the port. The redcoats are everywhere. The governor's no longer elected. He's appointed by the king. This isn't paranoia. It's the coercive acts, what the Crown called necessary measures, what the colonists called the intolerable acts. Passed in 1774, they were meant to punish Boston for the Tea Party, but they did more than punish. They unified. Across the colonies there was shock, but then, something new, sympathy. Virginia sent wheat and corn to feed the hungry in Boston. North Carolina raised money. South Carolina sent rice. Towns that had never spoken began writing letters, forming committees, offering aid. For the first time, 13 colonies, each with their own laws, customs, even currencies, started to see themselves as one. Protest was turning into purpose. In September 1774, delegates from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia. It wasn't yet a government, not even close. It was called the First Continental Congress. But even that name was a step, a sign of something larger forming. They didn't talk about independence, not yet. Most still believed they were loyal subjects, just demanding their due rights as Englishmen. But they debated fiercely. Should they petition the king? Should they prepare for war? Should they boycott all British goods? The debates ran long into the night. Some feared provoking Britain further. Others feared waiting too long. But through it all, there was one shared belief: if they can do this to Boston, they can do it to any of us. That was the tipping point. The colonies were no longer just watching each other. They were defending each other. Think of it like neighbors after a storm. First, they tend to their own homes. But when they see the roof blown off down the road, they bring their ladders, they bring bread. They bring hope. That's what the colonies were beginning to do. They weren't just resisting, they were organizing. They formed the Continental Association, agreeing to halt all trade with Britain until the acts were repealed. They enforced it, too, not with soldiers, but with ordinary people, shopkeepers, farmers, women's groups, blacksmiths. They created local enforcement committees. They monitored merchants. They refused to drink tea, wear British cloth, or stock imported goods. Some broke ranks, of course, but those who stayed loyal to the crown, loyalists, found themselves increasingly on the margins. The tide was turning, not just in policy, but in identity. The revolution didn't begin when a bullet flew. It began when the colonists stopped thinking like Virginians, New Yorkers, or Georgians, and started thinking like Americans. One young delegate wrote in a letter, "I do not know if this union will last, but I know it must begin." That was the heart of the moment. Doubt, yes. Disagreement, constant, but beneath all the chaos, conviction. And it wasn't just men in waistcoats debating in Congress. Ordinary Americans, especially women, led boycotts, created homespun alternatives, and turned their households into mini-revolutions. They taught their children not just how to read, but what to believe. So the colonies stood, not yet in open rebellion, but no longer content to kneel. They had not declared independence, but they had discovered something more dangerous to any tyrant: unity. The First Continental Congress adjourned in October 1774. There was no banner waved, no anthem played, just a warning sent to Britain, and a vow whispered between colonies: if one is attacked, we all are. They didn't know that in just months, gunfire would crack across the fields of Lexington. But they sensed it. The storm was building, and what had started as protest was now a purpose that would demand more than boycotts and letters. It would soon demand blood. Thank you for watching Liberty Unfolded. If this story moved you, share it, subscribe, and let us know in the comments.